Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello, and welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about, are we really eating too much meat? And can beef fit into a healthy diet? My guest today is Dr. Shalene McNeill. She's a registered dietitian and nutrition scientist. She oversees the nutrition science, health, and wellness strategy for National Cattlemen's Beef Association, which is a contractor to the Beef Checkoff. And that includes its nutrition research pipeline, science communications, and health professional outreach programs. For nearly 20 years, Dr. McNeill has been dedicated to researching and applying evidence on the importance of nourishing, wholesome foods. Dr. McNeill holds a bachelor's degree in biomedical science and a doctorate in human nutrition, both from Texas A&M University. Welcome to the show, Shalene.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I can't wait to get into our conversation. You and I have worked together for many years as I've been on the Beef Expert Bureau, and we often have conversations about, are people really eating too much protein or meat or beef? So I feel like this has kind of been a long time coming because it's something that you and I are both passionate about is, kind of like, let's sort out the science here and let's clear up any confusion. But I do want our listeners to know that this podcast episode is a collaboration between Sound Bites and Beef It's What's for Dinner, a contractor to the Beef Checkoff. And as a compensated member of the Beef Expert Bureau on behalf of the Beef Checkoff, my role is to share the science and support for beef's role in a healthy diet. And I have learned so much over the years being on this Beef Expert Bureau, and I have learned so much from you. You really know the science, and you also love the consumer insights like I do. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I want you to tell us about yourself and your background, especially your expertise in animal protein or meat protein.
Sure. I love that I'm a registered dietitian. It's the best career decision I ever made is to become a registered dietitian. And I'm so glad also that I did take the time to do that PhD in nutrition science because my background, I started out in biomedical science when I started college. I'm the first generation college attendee in my family. And so I didn't get a whole bunch of guidance about where to go. And I just knew I liked sciences. So I started with something really broad. And through a series of unexpected events, I didn't get into PA school. That's what I thought I was going to do after I finished my biomedical science degree, go become a physician's assistant. And what they say, somewhere somebody closes a door, somebody opens a window. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was one of the best things that ever happened to me is not getting into PA school, because what that did is it made me really think about how did I want to take my career and my education. And for me, the place in nutrition, in science, was where it made sense for real people. And nutrition was exactly that intersection. I'm like, I can make sense of science when I have something very practical to relate it to. And I think that's what you and I enjoy about the consumer insights as well. Mm-hmm. And nutrition is the science that people do 3 times a day and more. We eat, and then that took me into the sciences. And then loved my science work, so ended up doing a PhD. But still, even after I was a registered dietitian in nutrition science, never imagined that I would work on behalf of beef farmers and ranchers. But I ended up doing that because I was exposed to them through some other work that I was doing and became really interested. My actual PhD work was on eggs and understanding how we could maybe make eggs healthier at the time by enriching them with omega-3 fatty acids. And eggs were struggling because there was a lot of concerns about cholesterol. But as it turns out, when it came to beef in the late 80s, early 90s, and mid 90s, there were still those same concerns about beef and cholesterol, some of which still linger on today. So I got introduced to the interest of beef farmers and ranchers to focus more on nutrition. And from that just led me to my career working on behalf of farmers and ranchers. And I can't believe it, but I've been working on their behalf now for almost 20 years.
Wow, that's a long time. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. And like I said, I've enjoyed learning from you and hearing about animal protein and animal science and animal agriculture. I'm sure you get this question a lot, so I want to just kind of get to it instead of later on in the conversation. what do you say to people who assume or maybe even criticize that your perspective may be biased because you work for the beef industry?
Yeah, well, certainly there is no doubt that my perspective is influenced, by what I see and what I do on behalf of beef farmers and ranchers and the role that I play for them. I mean, I spend my work days immersed in looking at research on beef and interacting with farmers and ranchers. We're visiting ranches. I'm working with colleagues, registered dietitians, and other nutrition scientists to educate health professionals about beef. So that's for sure the lens that I have. And my perspective is going to be influenced by what comes across my desk. And it's also influenced by life in general. I think raising children has influenced my perspectives about beef too, just how people eat and how you feed a family and what people like to eat and how that works for them to eat healthy. And so I'm influenced by that as well. But I think part of what drew me to science and to work on behalf of beef, because beef is a challenging food in the field of nutrition, and it's my natural skepticism. I never want to be that person who is closed-minded or can't see or hear other perspectives about beef. So I think that's one of the things that's so fun. In my role with beef, we get to work right hand in hand with farmers and ranchers about the opportunities and the concerns that they have about beef and health and what they're hearing from consumers and the public. And we get to conduct research to better understand what those concerns are. So I love talking to other dietitians, nutrition scientists, medical doctors about what their concerns are, and then have the fortunate position to work on behalf of farmers and ranchers who are willing to fund that kind of research and have that commitment to understanding beef. One of the stories I like to tell is that in committee meetings, we actually meet with our farmers and ranchers where they get to look at the research that they want to fund. And one of the topics that always comes up is there anything about beef that we should really be concerned about? And so we'll have those discussions. And I've had farmers and ranchers come to me in meetings and say, if there's a problem with beef and health, we want to understand what it is. And so I think that's one of the fortunate positions that I have, is to be in a place where farmers and ranchers really do have a commitment to understanding, and they want people to enjoy beef as part of a healthy and balanced diet. So I think all of those things together, influence my perspectives about beef, and seeing their commitment to the work that we do drives a lot of my passion, but certainly it's influenced by what I'm seeing and doing. And I have really positive influences from the beef industry and my experiences there.
Thank you for addressing that. And I have to say, I see your curiosity and your passion and your openness, and you're so professional. And, I've seen you present at multiple professional conferences, and it is just really great to work with the beef team and work with beef ranchers who, like you said, they really do want to have that dialogue and they want to address people's questions and concerns. Now, a lot of different topics might come up during our conversation, but the one that we want to spend the most time on today and that we're really passionate about delving into here is that idea that we hear in the media and amongst family and friends that, it could be, we're eating too much protein, or what's the big push with protein, or Americans just eat too much meat, or beef. It's kind of like protein, meat, beef, maybe it's kind of all lumped in together. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. And so I want to hear from you about the research and the insights and the perspectives that I think will help all of us kind of take a step back and see the bigger picture. Certainly, I'll just put this out there at the beginning because I talk about it on the podcast all the time is, plant-based diets. Yes, we all need more plants in our diets. We all need more fruits and vegetables where nobody's getting enough fiber. I think these are things that we all agree on. But I'm passionate, like you are, about enjoying food with health in mind and enjoying food like beef and the role that it can play in a healthy diet. So let's dive into the science that you've seen, the research, the insights about, are we eating too much meat? And I know that there's dietary guidelines recommendations that we can touch on as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad we're talking about this. And I could not agree with you more. And I don't think our farmers and ranchers could agree with you more that we all need to eat more fruits and vegetables and plant-based foods. And I've got a t-shirt that says, eat your darn vegetables, because I think sometimes my job would be a lot easier if people just did that in terms of how we think about meat, because one of the big challenges with perceptions about meat is that we're still looking, much of the research looks at unhealthy diets with meat consumption, as opposed to looking at what we're all recommending, and that's a healthy and balanced diet with beef or meat consumption. But I think that this topic of, are we eating too much meat is really what I view as one of the biggest myths in nutrition. And one of the places that I come from, and this because we work together, is not only my skepticism, but if I don't understand something, I can't move past it. And that's why I think it's probably one of the things in science that got me there is my curiosity. I really need to understand something. So when I hear blanket general discussions about, well, everybody knows that Americans are eating too much red meat or too much beef, just this general assumption, my natural brain goes to, okay, well, how much are we eating? Let's talk about what the data shows that the actual consumption is. And then what does the science show about how much supports a healthy diet? And that's where we start to see big disconnects or breakdown between this generalized message about cutting back on meat intake versus what actual Americans are really doing. So I think it's important. I'm glad we're talking about it. I mean, one thing a lot of people don't realize is that national meat consumption, it definitely has shifted. We hear a lot about how Americans eat so much meat in general, but we've seen that national meat consumption has shifted. But people don't realize that since the 1980s, since our first dietary guidelines, beef consumption has actually gone down about 24%. So we're only eating about 1.7 ounces, so less than 2 ounces of beef. On average, Americans are only eating less than 2 ounces of beef per day. A lot of people just have a hard time getting their head wrapped around that. Chicken and poultry consumption has nearly doubled since the 1980s. So our meat consumption is shifting. We're eating more white meat, poultry, that kind of thing. We're eating less beef than most people realize. But even all of the meat that we're consuming on average in the U.S. is still pretty close to what the dietary guidelines recommend. And I think that is so important because you hear so much about meat consumption and maybe shifting our intakes with meat consumption, yet the guidelines recommend 5.5 ounces. The average American is eating 5.8 ounces. So we're doing pretty darn good with meeting our total meat and protein group consumption. And like I said, the opportunity there is to then just build out more fruits and vegetable intake. It doesn't have to be at the expense of meat. And I think a lot of people just don't realize that, in terms of what the actual data is showing.
Great. Yes. So the dietary guidelines, just to recap, recommends about 5.5 ounces of lean protein a day. And Americans are eating approximately 5.8 ounces of protein a day, which includes that less than 2 ounces of beef per day. And obviously this is averaged out. Most people aren't eating beef every day that I know of, but so averaging that out. So that's a really big point of differentiation there, or clarification, I should say. And maybe there's the protein conversation, and maybe that should be separated out from the beef or the red meat conversation. Mm-hmm. But that provides, like I said, some clarification. Now, we know that there's also the recommended amount of protein per day, like 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight that dietitians know. But I'd also like you to address the acceptable range of protein, the AMDR, because a lot of dietitians are familiar with that, but not a lot of the general public is. But it makes sense when you look at what percentage of your diet should come from carbohydrates, what percent from protein, what percent from fat. But I'd love for you to compare these kind of specific recommended amounts.
Yes, because I think one of the cornerstones of good nutrition advice is flexibility, right? Most of us that are trained as dietitians, that we definitely know that we've got to be flexible with our recommendations. But I think a lot of things, as we were talking about the red meat consumption conundrum, I guess, and sort of what these data really show. And when we compare how we're consuming versus dietary guidelines, for example, I think we got to keep in mind that those numbers, when we say, hey, we're only eating 2 ounces or less of beef per day, and that's within the dietary guidelines, the dietary guidelines is just a recommended pattern. That's a sample. That's one way that you can do it, right? That's one way you can build a balanced diet. It's one good way to build a balanced diet is to follow the specific meal patterns in the dietary guidelines. But if you look at the dietary reference intakes, the other pieces of authoritative nutrition advice that we have about how you can actually build a healthy diet in a lot of different ways, we know that we have something called the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or the AMDR. So many people talking about macros these days and just trying to figure out what's that ideal combination of protein and carbs and fats that we can put together to build a healthy, balanced diet. And we think about it in terms of our technical nutrition expertise. It's the AMDR, that acceptable macronutrient distribution range. And what that tells us and shows us is that there are ranges of protein and carb and fat that we can mix together to build a healthy diet to meet our nutrient needs and prevent chronic disease risk. So all of those ranges allow us a good, balanced nutrition advice. And for protein, that range, that AMDR range, is somewhere between 10 and 35%. For carbs, it's like 45 to 65%.
Of our calories.
Of our calories, that's right. And fat, it's 20 to 25%. So those ranges, like how we mix up our calories, how we break down our calories between protein, carb, and fat, we have some flexibility. Why there has been so much attention on protein is because for so long we focused on fat, low-fat diets, that kind of thing. And protein was just not really getting a lot of attention. But in the last decade and more now, we've started to realize if you increase the protein in your diet, you might have some other benefits like appetite control, satiety, muscle building. And so most Americans are only eating about 15% of their calories from protein right now on average. So no, we don't have a protein shortage. No, we're not under consuming protein. We're getting the basic protein we need to prevent protein deficiency. But we have this range up to 35% of our calories to take from where we are, 15%, up to 35% of our calories. And what happens if we do that? Are there benefits for, substituting out some carbs or some fat in place of protein? And that's where the research has really shown that there might be some health benefits of doing that. And that's why there's been a renewed interest in increasing protein and maybe a new discussion for how beef might support healthy diets.
Right, especially for certain populations. You mentioned this deficiency, and that's the dietary guidelines are set to prevent a deficiency. But this AMDR range can go beyond deficiency, and certain populations may need more protein or benefit from more protein. I've talked about protein a lot on the podcast, and I've talked about beef. I've talked about sustainability. I will link to all of those related episodes in my show notes, of course. But one of the things that I learned about protein, and we're hearing more about this, is that sarcopenia. As we age, even I believe in your 30s, you can start losing muscle mass. And that has just been really interesting for me as I'm aging as an active individual and trying to maintain my muscle mass. And I have a history of strength training and all various activities, of course, but it's been really interesting to dig into that research and distributing the protein more evenly throughout the day, because we tend to not have much at breakfast and the majority of our protein at night. And again, those are things I've talked about on the podcast. So I appreciate you kind of explaining to our listeners about the AMDR. You also mentioned with regard to plant-based diets, a common perception is if we want a plant-based diet, that means we need to cut back on meat or other animal proteins in general. And as you said, that's not necessarily the case. And I think it depends on the person. And I think one of the things that makes this conversation, I don't want to say difficult, but just complicated is because different people have different needs. So it's really hard to generalize depending on, are they infants or teenagers or elderly? We all have different nutrient needs. So I want to continue hearing about any research or specifics about meat consumption, but also we mentioned the consumer insights earlier. You have a wealth of knowledge on what people think about beef and how they enjoy beef. And I think a lot of that is not what we see portrayed in the media. So I would love for you to address that.
Yeah, I think I love hearing and seeing what the public thinks about beef, because it's really different than what you might feel the headlines say about beef sometimes. I feel like we definitely see media headlines that are often inflamed and negative about beef intake. But when you actually talk to the consumer and actually talk to other registered dietitians, I think they have a much more balanced view of the world and of diet and of beef. And what we know about today's consumers is that most of them see that beef can be part of a balanced diet. I mean, they have questions about the fat content and the cholesterol content and all that. That's sort of left over from 30 years of negative information about fat and cholesterol, really. But I think they have really balanced views, and when you ask them, what kind of healthy diet are you most motivated to try, they talk about eating balanced diets that have a mix of meat and vegetables and fruits, and then that are inclusive and all that. And I think that's one of the great insights I love. The other piece of it is we know that they consider protein as one of the things that they're looking for. So when they're going out looking for foods to choose, they're looking for protein, and beef is their favorite protein choice when it comes to taste. And they see it as giving them great nutrition. So I think the public has really balanced views in terms of the way that beef can fit into their diet. And they really are looking for positive ways to include it in a healthy diet. I think that's the other point that I always love hearing is they want to eat a healthy diet. The public wants to eat healthy, and they just want simple. We talk about this all the time, Melissa, tell me how to do it. Tell me what to do. Don't tell me what not to do. Mm-hmm. They're really looking for that. And we just finished a partnership, or we're in the midst of a partnership with Produce for Better Health that I'm so excited about, because we're working together to show how you can beef up your burger. You can eat a regular, real beef burger, and what a great opportunity that is to increase your produce consumption with that burger. And I think that's the perfect balance. One of the things I wanted to say when we were talking about what do we have to swap out for plant proteins and all, keep in mind that about 40% of the American diet is from these empty calories or discretionary calories. So if we're making substitutions or improvements in most of our diet today, a lot of it doesn't have to come from other nutrient-rich food groups. It can come from the extra things. People still have a lot of room to substitute nutrient-rich foods for less, nutrient-rich foods.
I'm glad you brought that point up, because I've heard you make this point before, and it's so huge. When we're rebalancing our diet and we're trying to, obviously, if we're trying to get more of something in our diet, we're usually not wanting to add it on top of what we're already doing, unless we need to gain weight. But we're like, okay, if I'm adding this, what do I take out? And, it sounds so obvious when you say it, but it kind of gets lost in the ether. I think that, maybe the best thing you want to swap it out with is one of those empty calorie choices, or, that's where you want to make that balance better. You also have something I'd like you to share with the listeners that you said this, it's so obvious, but I've never heard it put this way. When you talk about how the general diet is already plant-based. Mm-hmm. You use your words because it's so interesting the way you kind of enlighten us with this obvious fact.
Well, that's right. We often hear guidance that we need to shift our diet toward a plant-based diet and away from an animal-based diet. But again, if you look at the actual calories that we're consuming on a calorie basis, right now about 70% of our calories already come from plant foods. Maybe not the plant foods that you think about, but crackers or chips or cookies, or those are still, plant-based products. So we're eating a good percentage of our calories as plant-based. Only about 30% of our calories are coming from animal-based foods. So I think it's not necessarily the best direction to say shift to a plant-based diet. What we want people to do is eat more high-quality plant foods, just like we want them to eat more high-quality animal foods. Overall, the biggest change that most people can make in their diet is to go towards more nutrient-rich foods within each food group that they're consuming. And that's what I love about the new dietary guidelines, because they really underscore nutrient density and nutrient richness as that opportunity to increase our nutritional status.
Excellent. Thank you. I also wanted to maybe touch briefly on plant-based diets with regard to plant-based burgers. Is there anything that you've seen in research or consumer insights, or, with this plant-based burger trend that people might find surprising to learn?
Well, I think there's more and more recognition that they're not nutritionally superior. Plant-based alternative burgers are not nutritionally superior to real beef burgers, for example. And in fact, if you really look, even though the labels on many of them have been matched for protein, for example, when you actually peel back the layers of that, what you'll see is that many of the alternatives obviously use a lot of ingredients. They're more processed than many consumers are looking for today. So they don't necessarily have a comparable nutrition profile, I think as we dig deeper, one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, so does the body handle them the same way? Are they digested the same way? Can you use the nutrients out of them the same way? And that's some research that we've been looking at, others have been looking at. There was some research actually published here recently from Duke researchers that showed that metabolically, they're very different. When you look at the metabolites in an alternative burger or a plant-based burger versus a real beef burger, they're very different from an overall nutritional composition, even though the labels can be matched to show the same thing. So I think the takeaway, on that is they both, real burgers and plant-based burgers, can certainly have a place in a balanced diet, and if that's your preference. But one of the challenges, I think, is you can't just necessarily assume, and I see people doing this, is that you'll have a plant-based burger with a large soda and fries and a 1,200 calorie meal. I mean, you can build a very indulgent plant-based meal burger, and that's a lot of the ways that we're seeing it served. So I think the opportunity is, even when you're having real beef burgers, is to do it more like what we were talking about, finding ways to increase the nutrient richness of it as opposed to just use it as an indulgent substitute, which you're not necessarily netting out any health advantage by doing that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's what I'd seen myself, was that, they're not necessarily healthier versions of, a beef burger, and that they can carry the same calories and fat, and that, a lot of people just assume that it's healthier. Mm-hmm. And that's where I like to step in and say, okay, hey, if it is, great, but let's not make some of these assumptions. Let's really look at the facts and, make that informed decision that you want to make. And if you like the way that tastes, or it's what you have a taste for, go for it. But another thing that I thought was interesting that I've heard is that it's sort of like it's a novelty item. And of course, it's becoming more mainstream, but that people weren't necessarily having plant-based burgers instead of beef burgers. They're actually adding it to their repertoire. So I found that really fascinating too.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things I was going to say is that it's natural to be curious about different products. We're always trying new products at our house too. And so I think there's some natural curiosity that goes along with that. But that is what we're seeing is that beef and meat is such a staple in the diets of most people by and large. And so while we're seeing consumers try these products, they're not trying them at the expense of beef or poultry or any other meat. They're really just trying them on top of that. And what more recent market research is beginning to show is, while some brands may be increasing here and there, what we're not really seeing is an overall growth in the entire category, right? So some of these products are beginning to cannibalize the other. So you try one brand and you want to try another brand instead. Mm-hmm. But they're not necessarily replacing beef in the diet. And we've been eating beef for millions of years, or meats. And so I think, and it's such a staple in so many people's diets, that meat consumption, while overall we talked about some of those shifts and trends, the actual amount of meat and protein that people eat in their diet has stayed pretty stable over the years. When you look at the way that is, and there's actually some research that's wondering about that. Like, is there this protein leverage hypothesis? Like, once you eat a certain amount of protein, have you gotten that amount that sort of satisfies your appetite and satisfies your need? And people don't tend to eat a lot more than that. So that's another area of protein research that's been interesting, is that does that protein help overall regulate appetite in that way?
Interesting.
Don't you hear consumers talking about that it's hard to overeat protein, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, if you're eating a higher protein diet, it's not the thing that is easy to overeat on.
Right. And now would be a great time to just kind of give sort of a general overview about the nutrient profile of beef and how the cuts have gotten leaner over the years. Mm-hmm. And I have done some health-related beef research topics on the podcast. Like I said, I'll link to those. But if there was anything that you wanted to kind of touch on from a nutrient profile standpoint, or just how the research that the National Cattlemen's Beef Association is doing on beef and health.
It makes me think of the story, Melissa. One time we were talking to a group of dietitians and we said, what if we told you that half of beef's fat content was monounsaturated fat? Mm-hmm. And they said, well, if you told me that, I would think that beef is a lot healthier than I think that it is now. But they said, if you're the beef industry telling me that, I'm not going to believe you. Mm. And so we said, okay, well, what kind of evidence would you need to know that beef has half of its fatty acids as monounsaturated fat? And they said, well, maybe like some clinical trials, evidence and scientific research studies. And so the thing that always struck me about that, and I see not just with consumers, but with health professionals that I work with other scientists, because not everybody studies beef all day long. So it's not like you just have this magical memory of what the nutritional composition is, But a lot of people don't realize that half the fat composition is monounsaturated fat, and you wouldn't need a clinical trial. You could just show the nutrition data on it. You really wouldn't need a research study, but that shows how ingrained the thought process is about not really understanding beef's nutritional profile. And I remember when I became a dietitian and was approached by beef farmers and ranchers to work for them, I didn't even know. I had already been a dietitian. I was already finishing a PhD. I didn't even know that beef had one half of its fat profile as monounsaturated fat, much less the nutrient, And so on average, a 3-ounce serving of beef has 10 essential nutrients. And when I've looked at a lot of other foods to compare to, very few foods out there have 10 nutrients that they're considered either good or excellent sources of based on nutrition criteria for measuring good or excellent. So 10 essential nutrients for about 170 calories. And if it's lean beef, it's got on average about 150 calories. So that's a lot of nutrition. Sometimes we say it's a big nutrition bang for your buck. But the reality is no other protein source offers that same nutrient mix that beef does. And so that's not to say that beef is the perfect protein, but it certainly makes sense to mix that into your diet with all the other foods that you're consuming. So you're getting a mix of a lot of nutrients, because few foods really offer that nutritional package that beef does.
Yeah, it's high quality protein, zinc, iron, and B vitamins. I always forget about the monounsaturated fat. Like, that's how ingrained it is. And I think beef is healthy, and I choose lean cuts almost all the time. And I keep forgetting about the monounsaturated fats. So thank you for sharing that.
And of the saturated, we hear so much about saturated fat too, but in the saturated fat of beef, about a third of it is stearic acid. And we hear so much about stearic acid. It's found in chocolate, it's neutral, at least on cholesterol. So when you look at the overall fat profile of beef, we know that consumers tell us their biggest concern about beef is perceptions about the fat content.
Right, saturated fat.
So we have conducted clinical trials to look at, can beef be that protein of choice? So there's been research done. University, it's probably one of the areas that's the most studied about beef is beef and heart health, but there's a great study out of Penn State called the BOLD study, Beef in an Optimal Lean Diet, with Dr. Penny Chris-Etherton. And what she showed is that you can include a DASH style diet, but beef can be that protein of choice in a DASH diet up to 5 ounces a day, and you still lower your cholesterol. You still get those same blood pressure benefits that the DASH diet delivers. We've seen it in the Mediterranean diet studies where Dr. Wayne Campbell from Purdue University has studied, can you enjoy beef in a Mediterranean diet? And what that research showed is that you can have 7 to 18 ounces of beef per week as part of a Mediterranean diet and still get those same blood pressure lowering, cholesterol lowering effects. So a lot of people don't think about that beef can be the protein of choice in a healthy diet too, because the fat profile mix is also misunderstood about beef. And then we can talk about, the fact that beef overall has gotten leaner because farmers and ranchers have optimized the way they feed cattle. We're not feeding them extra anymore, where they're gaining a lot of extra fat on them that consumers don't want to buy. Grocery stores are trimming any excess fat on beef because we know consumers want and are looking for lean beef. And so now there are more than 30 cuts of beef that meet government guidelines for lean. So you can walk into any meat case in any grocery store across the country and find cuts of beef that are lean. And I always like to remind people to look for round or loin in the name. That's a good tip because there's a lot of beef cuts in the meat case. And so if you look for cuts that have round or loin in the name, so things like strip loin or round steak, eye of round, roast, sirloin, tenderloin, if it has round or loin in the name, when trimmed, it meets government guidelines for lean.
Yes. And, I remember learning the round and loin terms way back, probably I was still in school, but now there's so many more cuts that fit into those terms. So it has really evolved a lot over the past decade or two.
Yeah, there's a lot of great choices that are lean, to your point, beyond round and loin. And I would always encourage people to check out beefitswhatsfordinner.com because we've got lists of lean cuts, and you can actually search the recipes by lean if that's what you're looking for. And you can find just great recipes and tips for how to incorporate lean beef in a heart-healthy diet as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the website. And we're going to talk about that as we wrap up a little bit later too, because it is phenomenal. I mean, like, it has all the cuts of beef, the best ways to cook them. So if it's a leaner cut, it's giving you some moist cooking techniques. I like that. Like, I like recipes too, but I like that sort of information as well. If you're going to be doing a stir fry, here's the types of cuts of meat you want to look for. And it can get confusing because, as you know, Shalene, one cut of meat could have like 4 or 5 different names. And it gets so confusing. I always love when we used to get together in person for our Beef Expert Bureau meetings pre-COVID. We would always have
Bridget Wasser, our meat science expert. Yes.
Yeah, just showing us how to cut the tenderloin into filet mignons and the roast, and then how you have your tip into small little pieces for stir fry, and it's just always my favorite part of the meeting.
And we've actually got some tips of her on the website showing how to do that as well. So
yeah,
people love seeing that, and with trying to balance budgets and all that, it's a great way to do that, where you can buy bigger cuts and kind of multi-purpose use them in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, it's so easy. In fact, I'm going to get up the nerve. I did a video of myself cutting the tenderloin into the roast and the steaks and the small pieces for stir fry about a year ago, but it wasn't great lighting. And I don't know, I had like my reader glasses on or something, and it was just sort of a one take thing, but I think I'm going to put it in the show notes because it's so easy how to do it. So
yes, it is. And it's super functional. And I love doing it too, because it's almost like the batch cooking 2.0. So you have your cuts for all these different meals.
Yeah, it saves you a lot of money too.
Yep, it does.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Mediterranean diet, because I was going to ask, we hear so much about the Mediterranean diet and how healthy it is. And that was one of the things that I was surprised to learn, is how beef can and does fit into a Mediterranean diet. So thank you for addressing that. You talked about a lot of the research that has been done on beef and health is regarding heart health. And back in episode 154, I did an interview with Dr. Kevin Mackey on diabetes and heart health and lean beef. So I'll definitely link to that, as I said before. I've also talked a lot about sustainability, but if there's anything that you would want to share in this episode that people who might think, well, okay, maybe beef is healthier than I thought, and sure, people like it, and whether you're just the average person or you're a health professional and wanting to know what to recommend to your clients, some people are hesitant to really embrace having beef in their diet because they think it's bad for the planet. So I would love for you to just kind of address that at least briefly, and then if people want a deeper dive, there's these other episodes that I've done I can link to.
Oh, I definitely think that it's great that we have so much more curiosity and interest and passion around sustainability for our overall food system. And it's something that we should continue. It's obviously so critically important and a major part of what we think about in terms of healthy diets, that they've got to be sustainable as well. And so I would encourage any listener to learn so much about the beef production system, because what we know is that most people don't have the opportunity like me to get on ranches and to meet with ranchers about their practices and learn about what actually goes on in cattle rearing and cattle production and the meat supply chain. So definitely, I think one of the biggest things that I always come back to that just blows me away, even though I spent time growing up on a ranch, not one that my parents owned, but one that my dad worked on, but also then in my role with beef, is so many things. And that's why it's get on a ranch and learn. But a couple of big things come to mind. Cattle are ruminants. And so that's different than many of the other protein choices. For example, poultry are monogastrics, right? So cattle are ruminants, meaning that they can eat grass and forages that other animal source foods don't, and that we can't eat, right? And they can convert that into high quality protein. So they're definitely serving a role in our food system by using resources that we can't use for food production and making a delicious food that people love to eat that supports livelihood in so many different ways. So that aspect of that role, that unique role that they play, I think is just one part that I'm always fascinated with, and that they spend most of their life grazing. That's what they do. Even cattle that do go to a conventional feedlot system, for example, still spend most of their life grazing on this grass on land that isn't being used for production of other foods because it's not the right quality of land to be able to do that. And I think that's just really fascinating. Another sidebar is I just had the opportunity to visit a 20,000 acre ranch in New Mexico. And these cattle were on wide open, had open land to live on, and all 100 head that were in this one pasture that we were looking for were all together right in a little section of the piece of land. And I was just blown away and reminded that just the animal behaviors as well, like cattle are herding animals, so they do come together. And those are some of the misperceptions I think that we have about the system. Like when we think about a feedlot system, one of the complaints is, well, cattle are crowded in the feedlot. Well, on 20,000 acres, all of these cattle were together too. They're herding animals. So I think there's little things to learn about the production system that can help people understand that without a doubt, I think most leading experts still believe that cattle have an important role in our food system, in our ecosystem. And there's obviously bazillions of ways that we can continue to get better. And farmers and ranchers are working on that. That's what we want to do too. But we have a very nutrient-rich food that is being produced that the public really enjoys eating, that can support their health, and it can definitely support a healthy, sustainable food system as well. So learn about it. And our farmers and ranchers want to invite the public to learn more about what we do. We want to be open and transparent on this conversation because it's such an important conversation.
Right. And again, we're going to talk about what's on the website because there's so many wonderful resources, but I know there's a sustainability section there as well, so people can learn more there. And one of the things that I loved learning about most recently, and this was an interview I did with Frank Mitlerner from UC Davis about greenhouse gases and animal agriculture. I think it was episode 143 that this blew my mind. He's so amazing, just explaining how cattle are not only not the greenhouse gas problem that people think that they are, but they actually are part of the solution because they cycle carbon. I won't explain it like he does, so I want people to go and listen to that episode, but I'm telling you listeners, like, it's so complex and there's so much to the sustainability piece. Be skeptical, ask questions, but definitely learn more, like Shalene said.
That's right. And think about the trade-offs, because that's one of the things that has come to my mind too, that I've learned more. I think we're seeing more in the discussion and the scientific discussions about this too, is that one way may seem like, oh, that's the only way we should do things, until we start thinking about the trade-off for it, in terms of like, well, if we don't do this way of production, what way do we do it then? And is that necessarily a better way?
Right.
And when we think about sustainability, I think we're all recognizing this now. It's about more than just the greenhouse gas impact. That is definitely an important consideration, but it's also about the economic impact, right, of that food production system, or the social impact of how we produce food. And so sustainability is multidimensional. It's not just greenhouse gas measures. And I think that's also Dr. Mitloner, again, others really do such a fantastic job of helping you understand what is really happening and what the trade-offs are. That's how it always automatically come to mind.
Right. And I love the concept of trade-offs too. One of my frequent flyer guests is Jack Bobo, and he does a great job of explaining trade-offs. And that was just a game changer for me. And to your point, like, one system or production practice might work great on this particular farm or ranch, but it might not be the right fit for a different farm or ranch. And there's reasons for that.
And just like beef choices, we've got lots of beef choices in the supermarket for people to choose from, whether it be grass-finished beef, there's organic, there's natural, there's all these different kinds of beef choices. And that's not the same for every family. Every family is going to choose something that works for them. I may be looking for, a conventional ground beef cut that maybe is more economical than an organic beef cut, but all of those have great nutritional benefit. And you think we sometimes take for granted how fortunate we are to have the choices that we do have in our food supply, that most of us do.
Absolutely. So as we're wrapping up, I would like to just kind of hear maybe some takeaway tips for our listeners. Like, when it comes to beef consumption, what are your top recommendations? What should people be thinking about a little differently? And then we're going to go through what's on the Beef It's What's for Dinner website.
That sounds great. Well, one thing is, keep in mind that the beef cuts are very versatile. We talked about all the different ways that you can cook certain cuts and what we have there, but keep in mind that the versatility of beef cuts and how they can support so many different meals that you might be making. And so we talked about the lean aspects. I do like to recommend folks choose leaner more often. It's easy to do that because most of the meat case today, about 2/3 of the beef case is lean cuts, because we have been producing leaner cattle and trimming that excess fat, and we have a lot of lean cuts. A tip on ground beef that I like to share is that if you want to choose lean ground beef, it's great for like tacos and skillets and spaghettis and that kind of thing. Choose 90% lean or leaner ground beef if you're wanting to get a cut of beef that meets government guidelines for lean, at least 90% lean or leaner. And then the biggest thing that I think could make a difference in terms of healthy eating with beef is just what you pair it with. Beef is a perfect partner, as we've been talking about, for other nutrient-rich foods, produce, whole grains. And so think about beef for your healthy, quote unquote, healthy meals as opposed to just your indulgent meals. There's still this mindset that I'm going to go out and indulge and celebrate with beef. I'm going to eat a big steak, or I'm going to eat a gooey cheeseburger, right? Well, what about beef on your salad? What about a meal at home with a steak and broccoli and sweet potatoes? I think a lot of people don't think about it in the context of supporting a really healthy meal. And so that's a tip I like to share, is pair beef often with fruits and more vegetables. That's a really good tip. And keep portions in mind. I mean, a 3-ounce portion of beef is satisfying for a lot of people. In fact, that's the average serving size that's being consumed, is about 3 ounces. And so you're getting 25 grams of protein. If we look back at the protein research, that's just about the amount that supports great appetite control too. So a 3-ounce serving, 25 grams of protein, you're getting a really satisfying but sensible portion of beef, leaving plenty of room for all those other nutrient-rich foods that we're trying to get more of as well. And I think those are some good tips to get us started.
Excellent. Thank you. And, you mentioned the ground beef. And yeah, with that leaner ground beef is especially perfect for, like you said, spaghetti sauce or tacos where you're going to have other things flavoring it. You don't need all that extra fat flavoring it like you might want in a burger. But one of the coolest resources I got from Beef It's What's for Dinner is how to thaw safely and quickly frozen ground beef. So I'll put that in my show notes because that's been a game changer for me, because my biggest dinner dilemma is, I didn't thaw whatever, fish, beef, pork, whatever that is in my freezer. I forgot to thaw it. So now what? So that's, I'm going to put that in my show notes.
Yeah, that's a great tool. And we also have showing how to take, if you purchase it in bulk pack and you put it into, like we love doing this too. And we have some information on this on Beef It's What's for Dinner, where you put it into 1-pound packages and then put it out. It's so much easier to get out, use, thaw, have it. Sort of one of the dilemmas. We know that from our market research, one of the barriers that we have, I experience this too. If you buy a full package of meat, you put it in the freezer, you freeze the whole thing, it's kind of overwhelming when you only have an hour. You're thinking, we want to eat dinner in about an hour. How do I get that out and do that? And so we have tips on how to get that done ahead of time and make that easier when it's actually mealtime. A lot of our recipes, most of our recipes can be done in 30 minutes or less. We try to take into account the ingredients and those kind of things to make them really doable.
And I know that there's a lot of information on nutrition research. There's the sustainability stuff that we talked about. The cuts of meat is probably my favorite part of the site. Like we said, if you're grilling or you're doing burgers or you're doing whatever type of meal that you're trying to make, it'll suggest the best types of cuts for that. And vice versa. If this is what you've got in the fridge or freezer, here's the types of either cooking methods and or recipes that you could use this for. What else is on the site that I'm forgetting to mention?
So one of the areas that I use all the time when I'm preparing dinner is the cooking time. There's a whole section on cooking and cooking lessons. And we've got cooking times for grilling and smoking and broiling and oven roasting and sous vide and stewing. So all the different cooking methods and the cooking times, because I just have a hard time remembering, is it 20 minutes per pound of tenderloin that I need to go in the oven at what temperature? So all of those cooking guides and roasting guides are on Beef It's What's for Dinner. Obviously, the recipe section is just so great. Once a month, I do a TV segment in San Antonio with a beef recipe. And I'm just blown away by all the recipes and how truly flavorful they are. Some of them even I read and I think, I don't know if I'm going to like this that much, but they're triple tested. A lot of work goes into making sure that they're easy to prepare, but that they're also something that most people would really enjoy. And they're just really, really good quality recipes.
And I know that some of them, at least I'm assuming they're still on there, some of them are, and help me say this correctly, American Heart Association Heart Check?
Yes. So we have Heart Check. I don't know how many we have now, but there's a whole collection, more than 8 or so, I should keep in mind, but a dozen or so recipes that are American Heart Association Heart Check certified. So they meet the American Heart Association guidelines for a healthy recipe, a healthy meal. And so those are great tips. And then we've got other information on how to choose those lean cuts. So if you're wanting to eat a heart-healthy diet, and some of the research that supports that and how much beef. One of the things a lot of people, we talked about sort of the recommended ranges of beef consumption and all, but keep in mind that a range of beef can support health. So, and it's not that you sit down and eat 3 ounces every time you eat beef. Like we might eat an ounce of beef sausage crumbles in our breakfast tacos in the morning and may not have beef again that day. But then tomorrow night we may cook steaks on the grill and we're going to have more than 3 ounces, So this range of beef intake is an important consideration. Serving size really isn't a prescription. And I think you'll see recipes on Beef It's What's for Dinner that have a varied ways of using beef, not just as a steak, but as an ingredient or that kind of thing.
Right. No, I'm glad you mentioned that. So people can go directly to beefitswhatsfordinner.com. Or like I said, I'll have some variety of links in my show notes, including all the social media handles, and people can follow those as well. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us about beef as we're wrapping up?
Also on Beef It's What's for Dinner, you can get more information on raising beef. So a little bit more of a preview if you can't make it out to a ranch or you're too far from a ranch, but you can get a lot of great visuals and videos and that kind of thing to get you a little bit closer with beef. But I think I just would like to leave the thought with that while beef, certainly I think beef is a great food for health, and I've seen how it is, and we've seen the research on this, and I don't see anything in the science that keeps me concerned that you cannot enjoy a healthy diet with beef, and that most people have great health benefits from enjoying beef as part of a healthy diet. But I don't want to leave it that doesn't mean there's not room for improvement, because I think that definitely in our diets today, there's room for all kinds of improvement. That's part of why you're doing the mission that you have and the education that you have, Melissa, with your podcast. And that's the same for beef consumers, too. People who are enjoying beef, there's a lot more opportunity to improve our diets and our fitness levels and all. And I think that's something that we remain committed to as well. Like, how do we do that? Our recipes, how can our recipes make it easier for people to eat a healthy and balanced diet with beef? How can the education that we provide do that? So I think that's one of the things that I would leave that with is that, yep, there's definitely room for improvement with how we enjoy beef in the diet, but there's also a lot of populations, adolescent girls, older adults, some of those groups that really benefit from that high quality protein or those nutrients that could really value from including beef in their diet for health as well. And we're just here to try to support them in doing that in the most science-based way.
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess my parting thought here is instead of making the assumption that we're eating too much meat or eating too much protein, is to kind of take a step back and take a look at our behaviors and our consumption, but think about, am I getting the most nutrient-rich choices within my diet? Do I want to shift a little bit more plant-based, or maybe a little bit more protein is going to work better for me? And I always encourage people to try different things and see what works best for them. But the bottom line is nutrient-rich is where it's at. So thanks for being on the show, Shalene. It's just been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really so happy to be a part of it. I love the education. I've learned so much from your podcast, and I just appreciate the opportunity to share some of our thoughts as well.
Thank you. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.